region that I lived in wasn't so perfect, without a doubt. There were everyday issues with heckling, creepers taking photographs of female understudies while heading to evenings out on the ends of the week, and this wasn't even whenever that I'd first been followed. It was the very most awful. Frequently, I would recount a drag that I experienced that day, and they'd ask what region I was remaining in, and when I told them, they'd go, definitely, that is the reason I don't go there. I ought to likewise make reference to first, that I have quite terrible tension problem, and this day I almost didn't go into college at all since I just had a genuinely horrendous inclination. However, assuming I paid attention to each and every terrible inclination I got, I'd likely never take off from the house. In any case, so I disregarded it and chose to make myself go to class. My nervousness is so terrible on occasion that it's difficult for me to separate between a genuinely horrendous inclination and my mind going into survival mode, for in a real sense, no great explanation. Knowing the issues of the area I lived in, I deliberately dressed down however much as could be expected to limit consideration from creepers since I was in no state to manage it that day. My average look wanders into elective style, heaps of dark tattoos and dull cosmetics, the works, which will in general stand out in itself, so on this day I deliberately wore pants, a greatly loose shirt, and next to zero cosmetics. I calculated this would be enough for individuals to neglect me and just let me approach my day pretty much disregarded. All things considered, I was off base. A snippet of data that is truly pertinent to this is that there was a note message to each of the occupants of my loft block close to this time. Clearly, a man had as of late endeavored to attack a small bunch of young ladies from both our loft block and another understudy corridor condo block, close to 10 minutes away. It likewise incorporated a portrayal of the man. Not so much as 5 minutes subsequent to leaving my loft block, there's some person following me. Presently, right away, alerts truly didn't, as yet, ring. It's normal for aliens to move towards you in London, typically attempting to offer something to you, or just for the most part get cash off of you here and there or another. So I hear this person begin shouting toward me. Hello, excuse me. Be that as it may, I hold my head down and absolutely disregard him, which is typically sufficient to put off anyone attempting to sell you something. Indeed, when he then begins following me down the road and across the street, I realize this was a touch more evil at this point. He's getting logically more disappointed the more that I disregard him. His reason me's turning out to be more unshakable and in the long run transforming into, come on, I'm simply attempting to converse with you. As of now, my heart is as of now hustling like insane. However, I seriously love genuine wrongdoing, and I like to think I know the nuts and bolts of attempting to guard myself. In particular, with regards to not falling into the snare of being affable in any event while someone's making you self-conscious. What's more, soon after I go across the street with this person actually following me, I come into a progression of little shops. They're not so little as to not have any security. Simply the sort of spot individuals working in the space would swing by to get their lunch for the afternoon, etc. Considering both the safety officer and the surveillance cameras, I walk straight into the shop, trusting that this would be sufficient to put the creeper off. All things considered, we should not. I go into the main walkway and haul my telephone out, messaging my father to promptly call me. There's very little he can truly do as he lives the nation over, yet I calculated that perhaps seeing me on the telephone will put him off. Or that perhaps I could offer something like more. So you'll be here shortly? Okay, amazing. For hell's sake, assuming the worst, I assumed if something occurred, I basically had some type of observer on the telephone. My father, knowing about the issues that I've had with creepers nearby, calls me right away. We have a code for it in the event that I'm being followed, so I can tell him without being excessively obvious. However, I'm too terrified to even consider thinking often about being unobtrusive. The creeper is presently standing several feet down the path, professing to see things, however, for the most part, gazing at me. Meanwhile, he had his hood up, clouding the vast majority of his face, which made me extremely uncomfortable. Maybe he was similarly as mindful of the surveillance cameras as I was. He matched pieces of the portrayal of the man that we'd been messaged about. However, it was truly difficult to tell with his hood up, and he was likewise wearing a truly thick set of shades which hadn't been referenced in the depiction. As they were the most perceptible thing about him to me, I wasn't entirely certain on the off chance that it was a similar person. At the point when he understands what I'm doing, he then vanishes from the passageway. However, I'm mindful and remain standing where I was shaking and professing to be entranced by the container of Pepsi that was in my grasp. Meanwhile, my father attempts to shuffle, consoling me, asking me inquiries and offering me guidance on what to do. Not so much as an entire moment passes by before unexpectedly the creeper then returns, and with a case of donuts in his grasp. I go to him and snap a "What?" giving a valiant effort to clarify that I have definitely no persistence for him. He continues to inquire as to whether he can get 20 pounds for the donuts. I give him an irritated look and answer with a restless no, doing actually all that I can to attempt to cause my 5'3" self to show up to some degree threatening. He gives his all to seem hurt and irritated, giving a proceeding, putting down the donuts, and afterward leaving in the overall course of the exit. Once more, I'm not persuaded. I stand in that walkway for a brief period longer, let my father know what had simply occurred, and afterward move over into the following one, gradually investigating the whole shop for any indication of him. I'm remaining in the third path now, when he then returns once more, gradually edging his direction towards me. Once more, there's just a single other individual in the passageway, a shop representative that was stacking racks, and I'm marshaling up the fortitude to move toward the laborer and attempt to make sense of my concern when the creeper pursues for converse with me. Putting all of my adrenaline to utilize, I twist to confront him and afterward snap out a, "What? What is it that you expect from me?" Remembering all of the counter-creeper guidance that I'd seen web-based about causing, clearly you would have no desire to be a simple casualty the least bit. Furthermore, he appeared to be amazed by this, prior to muttering out something in accordance with, "I was simply contemplating whether, be that as it may, I genuinely couldn't make out precisely exact thing he was attempting to say over my damn heartbeat. So I see him and afterward say harshly, 'Disappear, simply let me be.' To which he then at that point gets back to his stunned and insulted act, then saying, 'God, all right, I was simply attempting to be pleasant here.' Which I answer with, 'All things considered, don't.' And afterward he storms down the path. I stroll through the shop one more 3 or multiple times to ensure he was truly gone this time. Meanwhile, still on the telephone with my father before I at last look at and afterward look out of the shop entrance. He's actually staying nearby, and I need to pick a second where he appears to be diverted by something so I can pull my butt out of there right away. I truly expected to get towards the cylinder station. As of now, I was an outright basket case, and the main explanation I didn't go straight back home was that I was totally terrified that he would follow me. The entry to my loft block inn must be portrayed as a back street. It was a tidied-up rear entryway, which frequently had individual understudies or laborers from the region on their smoke break. However, it was fundamentally calmer than the course to the cylinder station. I figured I'd simply progress forward with my way to college, which would at least get me out of the neighborhood for a few hours. Plus, it'd also give me the chance to see my friends and get some in-person comfort over what had just happened. My dad stayed on the phone with me right up until I was on my train, and I was looking over my shoulder the entire time, expecting to see the creeper follow me again. Now, I can see how this might have sounded like my anxiety blowing things out of proportion if this was my last encounter with the creep, but it wasn't. The following week, on the day of that same class was canceled, so I spent the day in my flat, generally being just an antisocial hermit. The week after, however, same day of the week, same time of the day, I was leaving again to go to class, certain that the encounter 2 weeks ago was just another charming story to add to my collection of gross encounters from the area. When not even 5 feet from the door of the apartment building, somebody falls into step with me. It's really not too unusual. With other students in the building, I figured it's just somebody who had a class at the same time as mine, making their own way to the tube station. And that's when I hear, "Hey, do you remember me?" I look up and I can't even manage to keep the dread from my face when I then see the creeper from 2 weeks ago. Right away, I tell him to go away, remembering how it worked the last time, but not this time. This time, he doesn't even attempt his shocked, offended act that he played in the shop, and instead even seems amused by this. He instead then says, "I'm just walking this way too." So I halted my steps and just gestured forward, then saying, "Go on then." Figuring if he's telling the truth, he'll keep walking and continue on ahead of me. Well, he doesn't. Instead, he just stops and smiles. It was that same freaking amused, sinister smile as before. And then he says, "Come on, why won't you talk to me?" Which I then respond to with, "Just leave me alone already." But I'm getting more and more freaked out by this creep, and it doesn't come out anywhere near as harsh as I wanted it to. He then does that creepy smile yet again. At this point, I start walking again, knowing that when I turn the upcoming corner, we'll be facing a music venue which pretty much always has either security or some kind of janitor right outside, figuring I can just go up to them and ask them for help if he doesn't leave me alone. He keeps trying to talk to me. "Do you have a boyfriend?" I'm tempted to say yes, hoping it'd get him to leave me alone, but I know that it'd more than likely just probably lead to even more questions. "How long have you been together? What's his name?" And probably just a bunch of other creepy, invasive questions from there. This guy doesn't even care if I have a boyfriend or not. He's just trying to draw me into conversation. Every time he tries to swerve a little, so he's now walking parallel to me. Just closer. I take a few steps away. I start to get more nervous and respond to that question with, "Oh, screw off." But he just keeps firing questions like, "Why don't you talk to me? I just want to talk to you. Don't you like talking to people?" But by now we're rounding the corner and I now spot a security officer. I immediately pick up my pace, going down a set of stairs that led towards nothing but the security guy, so that it's obvious what my intentions are. The creeper quickly says, "I'll just leave you alone then. You clearly don't want to be friends." He then disappears and I speed walk down the street to the shop that he'd followed me the first time. It's only when I'm outside the shop that I decide to stop and look around. He's nowhere to be seen. If he really had just happened to be walking in the same direction, I would have still been able to see him, because there's literally nowhere else to go from where I was walking. Which meant for me to not be able to see him, he'd have to have done a U-turn and started walking in a completely different direction altogether. After much pleading from my family and friends, who were really worried that this creep would show up again the following week, since this was 2 separate occasions on the same time at the same day, I went to the reception staff at my student halls. I told them about the incident, and they put me in touch with the police to make a report about it, since they thought it was the guy who we'd been emailed about. The police were, well, nowhere near as helpful. In fact, they didn't even get back in touch with me after I emailed them an entire account of what happened. The following week, my dad drove down from across the UK to walk me to class, with no sighting of the creeper. And for the rest of the semester, I left over an hour earlier than usual for that class, and just hung around campus to waste time. The silver lining was that this whole thing really made me appreciate my family, because they ended up memorizing my entire schedule, always making sure that I had a relative available to stay on the phone with me from the moment I stepped out of the flat to the moment that I was on my train, and vice versa. I honestly thought that was the end of the entire thing, until a few months later. I was now graduated and moved back to my hometown, when I then get a text from my best friend. It's a link to a news article about some pervert who had been in court for assaulting students in my area. And with the article, she then sent a text that read, "So, is this the guy who was following you?" The article had a photo of the man that it was about, and it was indeed the creeper that had been following me that whole time. And it was also the one we'd been warned about via email. He didn't have the glasses on that he'd had when he was following me, which made me think it was some kind of disguise, seeing as he was apparently already banned from being near any student halls at the time that he'd been harassing me. The article explained how the creep had started following other girls from the exact same spot that he started following me, only they did what I didn't. They were polite. Of course, I'm absolutely not blaming them for that. I was just really fortunate to have it drummed into me by a protective dad and an equally overprotective older brother. Screw politeness. It's better to be accidentally rude to somebody with good intentions than to give the benefit of the doubt to an absolute psycho. So when he plied them with question after question, and they'd rarely answered, he'd always ask them he knew them. And whatever they responded with, he'd then tell them and make a grab for them, assaulting some of them. And you want to know the worst part of all this? He got no jail time. He was given a curfew demanding that he'd be home before 6 a.m. and after 6 p.m. And I'd also like to add that in the same article, the police officer who hadn't been fit to bother calling me back about my report actually congratulated himself and his team for how well they handled the whole thing. What a load of crap. I'm still really working through severe anxiety issues, especially when it comes to being out in public alone. I'm never living in that city again.